It was a major tour in line with Iran's president's now familiar theme of expanding Iran's relations worldwide. Raeisi's toured 3 Latin American countries. While the Western and U.S. media cast this under negative light, that Iran, a sanctioned country, was visiting 3 other U.S. sanctioned countries, they didn't realize that it was for this very reason that this trip was significant. Hi, I'm Kavita Wai. Welcome to Economic Divide. Some of the highlights of this program: Ibrahim Raeisi's Latin American tour, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. This purpose, one of them, stand up to Western imperialism and also to show the world how the new world order is actually in motion. The next stop by Iran's president was to Venezuela. We will highlight some of those developments there. 23 MOUs, for example, that were signed to increase trade to $20 billion and to expand petrochemical cooperation, which were one of the focuses of the trade deals that were signed. And then the stop after that was in Nicaragua to supply that country with fuel and to participate in oil exploration and in turn neutralize U.S. sanctions, a dominant theme of these 3 countries' visits. Iran's president has toured several Latin American nations. They included Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. President Raeisi has said standing up to Western imperialism is the main message of the president's tour. During his trip to Venezuela, Tehran and Caracas announced their decision to increase the volume of bilateral trade to $20 billion.
ارتباط بین ایران و ونزوئلا یک ارتباط معمولی دیپلماسی نیست، بلکه یک ارتباط راهبردی است که 2 کشور رو که از منافع مشترک، نگاه مشترک، دشمن مشترک برخوردارند وجود داره. ما سطح روابط اقتصادیمون در حد 600 میلیون دلار بود در سال 1400، اما امروز سطح روابط تجاری و اقتصادی ما با اراده 2 کشور به بیش از 3 میلیارد دلار رسیده.
All right, it's time now for the social media posts. First up, Iran increasingly turning to Latin America to defy U.S. sanctions. That was one of the themes of this trip. It was a website we chose for that. Next one is also a website. Iran and Venezuela have common enemies. Raeisi says in Caracas, quote, Iran is playing a starring role as one of the most important emerging powers in the new world. Said Maduro, claiming that together we will be invincible. Next post, Iran's Raeisi urges unity to neutralize U.S. sanctions in Nicaragua visit, in which Iran and Nicaragua closed cooperation deals, as Raeisi admired the leftist state for its resistance against the United States. Quote, my trip to Nicaragua comes in line with the policy of expanding ties with independent nations. The world would be a better place if they put an end to their despotism and respect the will of other nations. And finally, Iran and Cuba vow to confront U.S. aggressive imperial policy, in which President Miguel Diaz-Canel said that, where both nations have had to face heroically with tenacious resistance the sanctions, the pressure, the threats, the blockades, and the indifference of U.S. imperialism and its allies. All right, those are some of the picks that we had for you. Of course, we try to cover the 2 countries in this case, since we're going to have Cuba be covered by Mahdi. That is Venezuela and Nicaragua. Let me introduce our guest for our first segment of our Q&A. First up, we will have Dennis Small joining us. He's the editor at Schiller's Institute's Executive Intelligence Review. Dennis Small, welcome to the program. Iran and Venezuela really enhancing their ties, especially in this trip. You have, first of all, the 20-year cooperation agreement that was signed last year. That was a big deal. And then you have the volume of trade that they project to increase from the current $3 billion to $20 billion. In terms of the importance, why is it important for these 2 countries to have this relationship be pushed to the next level as defined in this trip?
Well, I think they're important in and of themselves, but they're particularly important when you look at the global picture of which these emerging ties are part. And that is of a growing and I would say unstoppable wave for de-dollarization and towards the establishment of an entirely new international financial and economic system. This is taking place in a number of institutions, in the BRICS, what's becoming the BRICS Plus, in the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, the Eurasian Economic Union, and so on. But basically what is going on is that the vast majority of mankind is simply saying no to the policies which, especially over the last year, have converted the dollar into a toxic instrument, a weapon. This has to do both with the sanctions against Russia in particular, but also against Iran, Venezuela, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, you name it.
All right, thank you for that. Let's see what our guest, next guest thinks. Vinicius Rodriguez Vieira, he's the Associate Professor of Economics and International Relations at FWAP, a private university in Sao Paulo, who joins us. Vinicius Rodriguez Vieira, welcome to Economic Divide. You have the Iranian president making this Latin American tour, which is very important in terms of not only for Iran, but also for the three countries overall, because it's an opportunity to bust the sanctions that have been applied by the U.S. So that's on the one hand. And then you have, for example, the stop in Nicaragua, where you have these two countries that were born out of really two revolutions. And then, of course, the stop in Venezuela. What are your views when it comes to Iran's president's visit and the significance of the stops that he made?
Iran and Venezuela are both regional powers with increasing power in the world. We are living in an age of multipolarity, so it means that as long as regional powers like Iran, in case of the Middle East, in case of Asia, they gather along with other powers like Venezuela here in South America, in Latin America, they are therefore likely to build more economic ties that may reverberate into political ties. In turn, that's better for their own regions because more business opportunities are open, particularly business opportunities that do not depend on the mediation of the Western powers.
Time now for the InfoNews section of the program. First up, we're going to take a look at Iran's frozen funds. Iran, and this particular topic related to it, has made a lot of news. It regards the frozen funds that Iraq had, where it released it. It was $2.7 billion in total value. Now, the payment for Iranian Hajj pilgrims and basic commodities is where these funds were channeled towards, payment for those two issues. Now, in terms of our take on this, well, many are referencing this to the JCPOA for an interim deal, maybe an interim nuclear deal. There is no interim nuclear deal or deal of any kind at this point in time. Iran will only accept and return to the original JCPOA deal. That is the Iranian stance on this. Okay. Now, an alternative to canals, in this case, the point to the Suez Canal, was what the news stated, where Russia has revealed plans for this, what it calls the Suez Canal substitute. Russia said the cargo flow via the north-south transport corridor could triple in the coming years. Now, we took a look at this topic, and we had this actually in our previous program, which was on Mexico, where that country is also developing another alternative to the Panama Canal. Now, this may show countries' maneuvers to try to get some of the trade to flow through their countries and perhaps reap the benefits off of that, which could be one of the ways of looking at this piece of news. At least that's our take on that. Next up, the monetary value or monetary name for China's money, the yuan, is our next topic. Yes, we've talked about the yuan quite a bit, but it is emerging as a global reserve currency, and it keeps on that track in a rather high pace throughout the months. The world actually has taken significant steps towards ending the dependence on the US dollar something which we have said quite a lot. And again, our focus and analysis, therefore, on this is that, for example, BRICS is going to be announcing a common currency coming up in their August meeting, and that's going to be very important. At the same time, you had the U.S. Treasury Secretary who admitted that the dollar's appeal is eroding, especially when it comes to the dollar's reserve at central banks across the world. And that's a direct admission by the U.S. from the person who's completely related to this topic, and that's the Treasury Secretary. And finally, taking a look at a country here in West Asia, Iraq and its budget. It's a huge budget. It got approved a record $153 billion, the aim to create jobs, where this is the largest budget to date for that country, which is aimed at creating, as I mentioned, jobs in the public sector, for example, and to basically make sure that infrastructure in that country that had suffered because of the war and the U.S. imposed war on this country to at least recuperate. Now, we see this in the context where when you have this massive budget to be implemented and therefore then investments to be made, that Iraq wants to become stable. And this goes in line with other countries in the region who are really pushing for this stabilization. And especially this comes after the Iran-Saudi reconciliation. Those were the top stories that we picked, not top, but the stories that we thought was important. We would appreciate it if you send us some topics. Please do so. Contact information is on your screens now. It's time now for the in-depth section of the program. Iran's President Raeisi's Latin American tour, aside from all the MOUs that were signed, had a political message as well. Actually, there was a lot of them. But one of them, like-minded countries, especially ones under U.S. sanctions, have defeated imperialism. That was a clear message to the U.S. Now, in this segment, we will take a look at some achievements, minus Cuba, in which Matthew is going to present that to you in his quick take section. First stop, Venezuela. Both countries announced to increase their bilateral trade from the current $3 billion up to $20 billion. That's a significant jump. Now, during the visit, the two countries signed 27 agreements or memorandums of understanding. Of note was one that was worth $3.6 billion. This contract was considered as a starting point to move towards that projected $20 billion. Things like petrochemicals sector was one of the focuses of the MOUs that were signed. Next, we go to Nicaragua, the second stop of Iran's President Raeisi. While he was there, there were three major cooperation documents that were signed. The fields that it included were the judiciary, economy and trade, and medical equipment. That was significant in itself, and plenty of potentials from Nicaragua, who has a lot of mineral resources. Now, in terms of what we consider to be important, when you combine the three countries, you're looking at 35 memorandums of understanding that were signed with Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. The focus of the MOUs were on the fields of energy, industry, mining, and power plants. The basis of the work was to issue technical engineering services, that's important, from Iran, that is, export knowledge-based products, the supply of raw materials at reasonable prices, again, coming from Iran, and the follow-up on what Iran called the creation of new markets. Now, in the field of power plant construction, this is very important. You have a company by the name of MAPNA Group. It's a huge conglomerate, I should say. This group from Iran will provide products like turbines and power plants, in which the power plant construction work can be followed up with this engineering group. Okay? Now, the next point that we focused on, or points, which was not reported on, if at all, and it's probably a major factor when it comes to the world energy markets, are the countries with the most reserves who are politically aligned, and many of them are against the U.S. Now, these are the countries which have the most proven reserves of oil. This is the top 10 here, as you're saying. Number one, Venezuela, the first stop of Iran's president, around 300 billion barrels of proven barrels of oil reserves. Of note, obviously, Iran, 208 billion, Saudi Arabia with 267, and so forth and so on. Russia, of note, 80 billion, And what stands out here is the U.S., which is at number 9 with only 36 billion. Now, it's important that we listed all these over here because you get a sense of which countries are aligned with each other, politically, that is, okay? Now, let's move on to the next piece of data, which is very important, which is taken and extracted from what we just showed you. When you take a look at the 4 countries that are aligned with each other, namely Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, recently with the reconciliation with Iran, and of course Iran, and then Russia, obviously aligned with Iran, they comprise, in terms of the world energy, oil reserves in this case, 40% of the world's energy reserves, just those 4 countries. Now, there are other countries from that list of the top 10 that I just talked about, but they represent 40% of the world's oil reserves. Now, that would put the West, in particular the US, at a very vulnerable, if not weak footing when it comes to their accessibility to oil. If these countries, imagine, were to turn against it, what would happen? It's something to think about, okay? Finally, Iran's President Raeisi's Latin American tour familiarized us with some terms and jargons when it comes to things that are relevant today and what was in the past, namely the New World Order. It's a term that was used a lot by Iran's president. Under that, independence of countries, trade expansion, sanctions busting, de-dollarization, multipolarity, and multilateralism. This is what's important, and this is what the New World Order is all about. Not the old world order, of which you have things like unilateralism or imperialism, sanctions, dollar weaponization, or hegemony. Those are out. As a matter of fact, Iran's president made sure to say that imperialism has been defeated. Okay? Quite a mouthful there. Let's move on to our guests and see what they think about this. Let me introduce them, bring them back into the program. We have Dennis Small rejoining us, editor at Schiller's Institute's Executive Intelligence Review. All right, Dennis Small, welcome back. When you talk about this visit, obviously many important points, but the visit by Iran's President Raeisi included friendly countries. Now, the West said these are all countries under sanctions from a common adversary, the U.S. If you take a look at it from that lens, as such, they've all signed major trade deals now. Does that mean that U.S. sanctions policies have failed in that regard?
Well, I think the sanctions policy have failed, but I don't think we can think in terms quite as simple as simply moving on. Moving on under a situation of active decoupling of the world into 2 competing blocks, economic blocks, financial blocks, and military blocks. If we continue in this direction, no one is going to be able to simply move on because we will be on the trajectory towards war. And war today means nuclear war. That is the trajectory that we are now on. The expansion of NATO eastward over the last decades, right up to Russia's border and into their kitchen pretty much, has with it the implications stated explicitly so by both British and American policymakers that they're prepared and propose to create what they call a Crimean Missile Crisis, like the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.
God, what a doomsday scenario there by our guest, Dennis Small. Hopefully we won't end up taking that route or going down that route. All right, we now have Vinicius Rodriguez Vieira rejoining us, Associate Professor of Economics at FAAP, Private University in Sao Paulo. Vinicius Vieira, welcome back to Economic Divide. I'd like to get an understanding from you what we're looking at when we take a look, in this case in point, the different MOUs that were signed and business contracts that were signed between Iran and these 3 Latin American countries, because they're all under U.S. sanctions. How can they actually forge ahead to make sure that the fruits of their labor will actually pay off when it comes to their bilateral deals? Because the U.S. sanctions play a factor, but in essence, doesn't it also mean that the U.S. sanctions have failed?
I think particularly after the war of Russia against Ukraine and the sanctions that followed suit, it's pretty clear that not only the United States, but also its allies they don't have the power to control the world economy. And here I'm not making any judgment about that. It's just a fact. And of course, it's expected that the countries that are labeled by the United States as pariah states, as no-aligned states, they will tend to join forces in this new world and will make exchange and trade agreements, investment agreements. That's the new reality. Again, there's no judgment in saying that. That's just a matter of fact. So therefore, if the war against Ukraine by Russia served for anything thus far for the world, is to show that the United States no longer holds what is called weaponization of the economy. That is, any measures like sanctions are likely to have no effect at all. And even worse for the United States, those measures are likely to stimulate even regional powers that have good ties with the United States.
Iran and Nicaragua have agreed to step up their economic cooperation. Iran has pledged to supply fuel to Nicaragua, participate in oil exploration, and consider investing in a refinery to neutralize the effects of U.S. and European sanctions. Nicaragua, like Iran, is under U.S. sanctions.
پیروزی انقلاب اسلامی بین ایران اسلامی و کشور دوست و برادر ما نیکاراگوئه روابط بسیار خوبی بوده است. روابط ما روابط معمولی و سنتی نیست. روابط ما کاملا روابط راهبردی است. ما بنا داریم روابط سیاسی، اقتصادی، تجاری، فرهنگی و در همه حوزه‌ها به ویژه حوزه علم و فناوری را با یکدیگر ادامه دهیم.
According to the Nicaraguan president, the two countries share a similar past. Two countries that were born out of revolutions. As such, they have fought imperial powers like the U.S. The Iranian president's tour of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, all sanctioned by the U.S., is an effort for like-minded countries to team up together to beat the Western capitalist system, one in which the U.S. has weaponized the dollar and has imposed its colonial will to exploit their natural resources.
Hello and welcome to the Quick Take section. I'm Mahdi Abbasian. We have dedicated this section to Cuba, since it was not covered in the program. Naturally, we will take a look at Iran's President Ibrahim Raeisi's trip to Cuba and what was achieved there. Iran and Cuba signed 6 cooperation memorandums of understanding in the areas of judicial, jurisdiction, and comprehensive political cooperation, as well as customs relations and cooperation in the field of information technology.
از کارهایی که حتما در کمیسیون مشترک اقتصادی باید مورد توجه قرار بگیره، در بخش نیروگاهی و توانایی‌هایی که جمهوری اسلامی داره، این هم حوزه‌ای است که بین ما و کوبا میتونه یه حوزه فعالی بشه و فعالیت داشته باشیم. حوزه معادن از حوزه‌هایی است که میتونه در واقع محور همکاری‌های ما با کشور کوبا باشه.
It's a good time to reflect on the economic costs of U.S. sanctions on the Cuban economy. Sanctions can be traced back to when they were first implemented in the 1960s. That means 6 decades of U.S. sanctions, or over 60 years. The total cost to Cuba from the United States embargo is $144 billion, about $685 million annually. Some estimates have put the economic costs at over $800 billion. Cuba has also been active when it comes to establishing closer ties with Russia. It made a proposal to Russia to set up an industrial park with the Eurasian Economic Union. This would not only benefit the Cuban economy, but would help break U.S. sanctions' stranglehold on the island nation. Cuba has offered to lend the plot to the EEU for 50 years. This industrial park would make the Cuban market more accessible for companies in the EEU by setting up manufacturing, make direct investments, and strike up deals with EEU countries.
Искренне рассчитываю, что результатом бизнес-форума станет практическая реализация проектов в строительстве, цифровизации, сельском хозяйстве, транспорте, логистике, а также туризма.
That does it for this quick take section. Hope you enjoyed it. We would really appreciate it if you would send us your feedback. Contact info is coming up. I'm Matti Abbasyan, and I'll see you next week.
Well, in conclusion, the days when imperial powers like the U.S. sought to dominate other countries and to exert their pressure, like in the form of sanctions, on independent countries under the pretext of human rights and democracy, well, those days are actually over. That's something that the Iranian President Raeisi actually said. It's not something that we wrote. In terms of the overall theme of this trip, that's what was important. Iran, like the other countries it visited in Latin America, have turned threats and sanctions into opportunities, and through these opportunities, great progress has been made. Thus, imperialism has been defeated. That does for this edition of the program. This was a very important development, this Latin American tour. And in that respect, we really would appreciate it if you send us some feedback on this topic. Contact information is behind me. From Mikhail Tahway and the entire team at Economic Divide, it's goodbye until next week.